The courtroom fell silent as the boy prepared to reveal a truth that could destroy his family. Every breath felt like a ticking time bomb, but when his gaze met his mother's, everything changed. What happened next shook everything to its core. But let's start from the very beginning. Before we dive into this gripping courtroom drama, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We bring you the most compelling legal battles, untold stories of justice, and jaw-dropping courtroom moments every day. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Justice has never been this intense. The courtroom was deathly silent, a heavy air of anticipation pressing down on every person present. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting cold shadows over the faces of those who waited. Ethan Thompson, a 14-year-old boy with tousled brown hair and wide, frightened eyes, sat rigidly on the witness stand. His pale hands clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles a stark white against the wood. He was just a boy, but today he was about to speak the unspeakable, to testify against the man who had hurt his sister, Emily. His breath was shallow, his heart hammering in his chest as the weight of the moment sank in. This was no ordinary day. This was not some school project or awkward conversation. This was the courtroom where lives were decided, where his sister's attacker would either walk free or face justice. Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts jumbled, but one thing remained clear. He had to tell the truth, no matter how hard it was. Across from him, Marcus Weaver sat, the defendant, the man who had shattered their lives, who had taken something that could never be given back. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his posture perfect, an air of calm confidence radiating from him as though he had nothing to fear. He wore a practiced smile, smooth, controlled, and utterly chilling. Ethan couldn't tear his gaze away from the man whose eyes seemed to pierce through him, daring him to speak, to tell the world what he had done. The prosecutor, Sarah Whitfield, a no-nonsense woman with sharp features and a steely gaze, stood and addressed the court. Her voice was steady, clear. "Ethan," she said, "can you tell us what happened that night? What you saw? What you remember?" Ethan's mouth felt dry, his tongue heavy as though it had turned to stone. He glanced at his mother in the front row, her face pale and drawn, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Then he looked to his father, who had his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with barely contained emotion. Ethan knew they were relying on him, just as Emily would have. She couldn't speak for herself. She had been too broken, too lost to even understand the extent of her trauma. But he could. He was the only one who could tell the truth. His voice wavered as he began, a thin thread of sound escaping his throat. I remember it clearly," he said, his words tentative but sharp. "He told Emily that he had candy in his car. She liked candy. She went with him. He said he'd give her some. And..." His voice faltered, and he stopped for a moment, struggling to push the words out. The images flooded his mind. His sister, so trusting, so innocent, walking toward that car. He could still see it, the silver vehicle parked just outside their neighborhood, Marcus's wide, coaxing grin, his heart twisted in his chest. "Go on," Sarah urged gently, her tone soft but insistent. Ethan took a deep breath and nodded. He could feel all eyes on him, the jury, the judge, the spectators, and even Marcus, who never broke his cold stare. "She was missing for hours. We didn't know where she was. And then, when she was found, she was hurt." The words stuck in his throat, but he forced them out, each one like a bullet. "She was broken, bruised. I don't even know how to describe it. She wasn't herself. She couldn't talk. She didn't even look at us." A murmur ran through the room. Ethan could feel the shift, the tension thickening as the jury's eyes flickered with discomfort, disbelief. They hadn't wanted to hear this. They hadn't wanted to picture what he was describing, but he was saying it. He was making them face the truth. Ethan's gaze drifted to Marcus for a moment. The man had not moved. His smile was still there, though it had softened, replaced with a look of feigned confusion, as if he couldn't understand what Ethan was saying, as if none of it was real. Ethan's hands were shaking now, but he tightened his grip on the table, refusing to let the fear control him. He wasn't going to back down. I saw her the next morning. She wouldn't let anyone touch her. She was scared. She couldn't even speak without trembling. The room was so still that Ethan could hear the faint, rhythmic tick of a clock on the wall behind him. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he pressed on. That's when we found out. That's when we knew who did it. A chill fell over the room. Ethan's words had cut deep. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. The prosecutor stepped forward, her voice firm. Ethan, you're doing great. You're telling the truth, and that's the most important thing. Thank you. Ethan nodded, but couldn't bring himself to smile. He didn't feel proud. There was no victory in this. He had done what he had to do, but the horror of it all was too great to let him feel relief. His heart was still heavy with the weight of the truth, but he had spoken it. He had let the world hear it, and no one could ignore it anymore. But as his gaze flickered back to Marcus, he couldn't help but wonder, would the truth be enough? Could anyone believe a 14-year-old boy over a man like Marcus? Would justice prevail, or would the lies and charm of the defendant sway the jury in his favor? The tension in the room seemed to grow with each passing second, and Ethan realized that everything was hanging in the balance. His voice was barely audible when he spoke again, barely a whisper. Please, he whispered, though no one could hear him. Please believe me. And with that, the room fell into an even deeper silence, the weight of what had been said settling over them all like a thick, suffocating fog. The courtroom, already charged with tension, grew even heavier as John Harris, the defense lawyer, stood up to cross-examine Ethan. His every movement was calculated, smooth, and deliberate, an expert in the art of manipulation. He was the kind of man who could twist words to make anyone doubt their own reality, and today, his target was a frightened 14-year-old boy. The moment John began speaking, Ethan could feel the weight of his gaze, the coldness in his tone. Ethan, he said, his voice slick with false kindness. You say you remember everything, but tell me, how can we be sure? How can we be sure that your memory isn't clouded, that you're not simply mistaken about what really happened? Ethan's throat tightened. His hands, still gripping the edge of the witness stand, were starting to sweat. He had told the truth, but now, here in the face of this man's questions, doubt crept in like a slow poison. Could he have missed something? Could he have misunderstood what he had seen, heard, or felt? The doubt swirled in his mind, like the fog of confusion he had tried so hard to fight off. His chest felt tight, his voice shaky as he stammered out a response. I remember, Ethan said, trying to steady himself. I remember everything. It's not a mistake. His words faltered, the pressure of the room closing in around him. John Harris didn't relent. He pressed harder, his tone now sharpened, his questions more pointed. But you were just a child, Ethan. You were frightened. And this whole situation, it's a lot for a young boy to understand, isn't it? You're sure you're not confused? Ethan could feel his resolve cracking. The weight of those words, the certainty in Harris's voice, seemed to push at him from all sides. His heart raced, the walls of the courtroom blurring as he focused on the lawyer's face, knowing that every word was being used to strip away his credibility. He had to hold on. He couldn't let this man destroy his sister's truth. their truth. Suddenly, as if a switch had flipped inside him, Ethan's eyes locked onto Marcus Weaver, who had been sitting quietly throughout the exchange, his smug expression never faltering. The cold, self-assured gaze of the man who had hurt Emily, who had destroyed her innocence, was too much for Ethan to ignore. The weight of the moment, of all that he had witnessed, all that he had suffered, settled upon him with the force of a thunderclap. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to fade, and all that mattered was the man sitting across from him, the man who had done this to his sister. Ethan lifted his head, and his voice, soft at first, rang out with a quiet intensity that cut through the tension like a knife. "Why did you do it?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. "You didn't have to do it. You could have just left her alone." There was a sudden, palpable shift in the room. The air grew thick as everyone held their breath, waiting for the response, but none came. Marcus, who had been so confident just moments ago, faltered. For the briefest second, his mask slipped. His smile vanished, replaced with something that looked almost like doubt, but only for a moment. He quickly recovered, though the damage had been done. Ethan's voice trembled, but it never wavered. "I remember everything," he continued, his words now laced with a quiet strength. "I remember the way you looked at her, like she was just a thing to play with. You made her believe you were someone good. And you hurt her. You destroyed her. And you thought you could get away with it." There was no turning back now. Ethan's words hung in the air, suspended by the force of their accusation. The room was deathly silent, the weight of his revelation suffocating. The prosecutor, Sarah Whitfield, stood with a somber expression, her gaze moving between Ethan and the defense lawyer. She placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder, her voice soft but firm as she spoke. "That's enough, Ethan," Sarah said, her tone a quiet plea to stop the boy from carrying the burden any further. But Ethan wasn't finished. His eyes, filled with an intensity that was far beyond his years, moved toward the jury. "Please," he said, his voice now a raw cry for justice. "Don't let him get away with it. She's my sister. She didn't deserve this. Please, don't let him hurt anyone else." His plea echoed in the stillness of the courtroom, the final words hanging in the air like an unspoken prayer. The jury, the judge, the spectators, everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Ethan's words had done what no lawyer, no evidence, no witness had done before. They cut through the lies, the manipulation, the uncertainty. For the first time in that courtroom, the truth stood tall and unwavering. And as Ethan's eyes scanned the jury, his heart beat a little faster. He had said it. He had done everything he could. Now, it was up to them. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was his sister's voice, and he would make sure her truth was heard. The silence lingered in the courtroom, stretching on with the kind of tension that only comes when a decision is about to be made. But what would happen next? Would the jury believe him? Would they take his plea seriously? Or would Marcus, with his charm and confidence, somehow twist the truth once more? Ethan didn't know the answer, but he had said what needed to be said. He had taken the stand. He had faced the man who had destroyed his sister's life. Now all he could do was wait. The defense attorney's outburst shattered the tense silence that had gripped the courtroom. He leaped to his feet, his face flushed with frustration, as if trying to reclaim whatever control he had left in the face of Ethan's raw testimony. "Your Honor!" he barked, his voice sharp and defensive. "This is an emotional outburst. The boy's testimony is not reliable." His words echoed through the room, a desperate attempt to dismiss the damage Ethan had done. The judge, a woman with sharp, calculating eyes, didn't even flinch. With a swift, almost imperceptible motion, she raised her hand, silencing the defense attorney instantly. The authority in her gesture was enough to stifle any further protests. She gave him a single look, one that said everything without uttering a word, and he sank back into his seat, defeated. The room was still, but the air felt heavier now. Ethan had spoken from the heart, but even his boldness couldn't dissolve the layers of doubt and manipulation that hung in the air. Marcus had spent weeks carefully crafting his defense, weaving a web of confusion and falsehoods that clouded the truth. His smooth, rehearsed lies had made many question what had really happened that night. Despite Ethan's testimony, many still held on to the idea that Marcus could be innocent, unable to accept the darkness that Ethan was trying to expose. The judge's voice cut through the thickening tension. "We will take a recess," she announced, her tone firm, yet devoid of emotion. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. The bang of her gavel felt like a final verdict, even though no decision had been made. The room erupted into a low hum of whispers, each person in the courtroom sharing their own thoughts, their own theories. Outside, the quiet hallway felt like a refuge from the chaos inside. Ethan stood beside his mother, who was struggling to keep herself together. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from the tears she had been fighting to suppress. She looked at Ethan, her expression a mixture of pride and fear. "You did well," she said, her voice breaking slightly. Ethan could feel the weight of her words, but they didn't bring the comfort he had hoped for. They only reminded him of the battle that was still far from over. His mother's hand was trembling as it rested on his shoulder. He could feel the pressure of her touch, the unspoken fear she had been carrying for so long. For her, this trial was not just about Marcus. It was about their entire world, the family they had once known. Emily, his sister, had been shattered by the man sitting across from them in the courtroom. Ethan could see her in his mind, sitting in the back, trying so desperately to remain composed, but her eyes betrayed her. Her tears, though silent, were a constant reminder of the horrors they had all endured. Ethan's throat felt tight as he looked over at his mother. He wanted to reassure her, to say that everything would be okay, but he couldn't bring himself to lie. They both knew the truth. Nothing would be okay until Marcus was held accountable for what he had done. Despite the heavy weight of doubt that still lingered in the courtroom, Ethan's determination only grew stronger. He had told the truth. He had stepped up for his sister, for his family. He had made the stand, faced Marcus, and spoken the words that had been festering inside him for so long. But the road ahead was not going to be easy. There were still people who questioned him, still people who didn't want to believe what they heard. There were still people who would cling to their preconceived notions and their doubts, no matter how undeniable the truth was. But Ethan couldn't let that stop him. He couldn't allow Marcus to walk free, to return to his life as though nothing had happened. Marcus had taken something from them that could never be replaced: their trust, their peace, their sense of safety. Ethan's heart clenched at the thought of what his sister had endured, of the terror and the pain that had been forced upon her. Standing there in the hallway, with the weight of the entire courtroom's gaze still pressing on him, Ethan knew there was no turning back. He couldn't unhear the things Marcus had done, couldn't erase the image of his sister's broken spirit. The world had already changed, and there was no going back to how it had been before. They were in this now, as a family, and there was no walking away from the fight. Ethan looked at his mother, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw something in her eyes. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was something else, something like hope. She was clinging to it, just as he was. Hope that this would end in justice. Hope that they could somehow, through all the pain, find some semblance of peace. His gaze shifted toward the courtroom doors. In there, behind those walls, was the man who had shattered everything. But the truth had been spoken. The truth had been unleashed. And now Marcus couldn't hide from it any longer. "Mom," Ethan said quietly, the determination in his voice stronger now. "We can't stop. We can't let him win." His mother didn't respond immediately. She just nodded slowly, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Her lips quivered as she tried to hold back her tears, but her eyes were filled with something far stronger than grief. They were filled with resolve. "We won't let him," she whispered. And for the first time, Ethan felt the truth of those words, solid and unwavering. Together they would face whatever came next. The court would reconvene soon. The battle wasn't over. But Ethan was ready for whatever came next. The trial dragged on, the tension in the courtroom palpable as the defense continued its relentless attempts to tear down Ethan's testimony. They painted him as a confused, emotional child, unable to accurately recall the events. Each cross-examination was an attempt to exploit his vulnerability, trying to poke holes in his narrative. But the more they pressed, the more Ethan's resolve solidified. His hands still shook, his voice still trembled, but his words were becoming sharper, more certain, as if the truth had finally found its place in his chest and refused to leave. And then, the tide began to shift. One by one, witnesses came forward, their statements aligning more and more with Ethan's version of events. A neighbor who had seen Marcus's car parked near their street at the time of Emily's abduction. A teacher who recalled seeing Marcus inappropriately interact with Emily weeks before the incident. An old friend of Marcus's, who quietly came forward to reveal unsettling details about Marcus's past, how he had a history of manipulating and controlling people, particularly young girls. The pieces fell into place like a puzzle Ethan had been desperately trying to solve, and each new piece of evidence chipped away at Marcus's carefully crafted image. The defense's facade started to crack, but the turning point came when Emily, fragile but determined, was called to the stand. The courtroom held its breath as Emily stepped into the witness box. The trauma was clear on her face. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, had become shadowed, haunted by what she had endured. She sat there, trembling, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ethan could see the weight of her pain. But there was something else there, something flickering in her gaze, a quiet, fierce determination. She was here for justice. She was here to speak the truth. When Emily's voice broke the silence, it was steady, though quiet. "I remember what he did," she said, her voice trembling but unwavering. "I remember everything." Each word she spoke added another layer to the case against Marcus. She told the court how he had lured her into his car with promises of sweets, how she had trusted him, only to have that trust shattered in the worst possible way. She described the terror, the helplessness, the suffocating darkness she had felt during those hours. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the undeniable truth that could not be ignored, no matter how hard Marcus and his defense tried to twist it. The room was dead silent as Emily finished. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her face pale and drawn, but her strength was evident. The defense had no more questions. The prosecution rested its case, and the jury was left to deliberate. Ethan felt the weight of those moments, the agony of waiting. He sat at the back of the courtroom, his body drained from the tension, his mind racing. He couldn't bear to look at Emily, not wanting to see her in that state. But he couldn't escape the reality of what she had endured. She was his sister, and she had been broken by that man, but she was still here, still fighting. The minutes stretched on, each second a lifetime. The deliberation seemed to drag on forever, the uncertainty gnawing at Ethan's insides. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he prayed for a miracle, for justice to prevail, for his sister's suffering to finally be acknowledged. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the foreman of the jury stood. The room held its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Weaver, guilty as charged." A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. A soft gasp of relief filled the air, as though the entire room had been holding its breath and could now finally release it. Ethan's heart soared with a mix of disbelief and hope. He looked to his sister, whose face was now wet with tears. She was crying softly, but these were not tears of pain. They were tears of something deeper, of justice, of closure, of an end to the nightmare that had been haunting her. Ethan's eyes stung as he watched her. He had seen the girl who was once full of life, who had once danced and laughed without fear, and now he saw the woman she was becoming, a woman who had faced the unthinkable and had still managed to stand. In that moment, it was clear. They had won. Not just in the courtroom, but in their hearts. They had reclaimed something that had been stolen from them. Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his once smug, arrogant smile now gone. He looked at the jury, then at the audience, his eyes filled with disbelief, as though he couldn't comprehend what was happening. He had thought he was untouchable. He had believed that his charm and lies could shield him from the truth. But now, in the cold reality of those handcuffs, the truth had finally caught up with him. And it was too late. Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched Marcus being escorted out of the courtroom. The man who had taken so much from his sister, from their family, was finally being held accountable for his actions. The blood in Ethan's veins burned with a quiet fury, but there was no anger, no vengeance, just the undeniable satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. Marcus was no longer untouchable. He was no longer the predator who had wreaked havoc on their lives. He was now just a man facing the consequences of his choices. Ethan turned to his sister, her face still wet with tears. But there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes. A spark, a light. She had been broken, but now she was beginning to heal. And so was he. Together, they had survived. Together, they had fought. And together, they had won. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan allowed himself to smile. A slow, painful smile, but one that carried the weight of everything they had endured. They had survived the storm, and now they could begin to rebuild. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and let us know in the comments which courtroom drama or legal battle you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video.